What if the greatest revelation of the 19th century did not come from heaven, but from a local library? In 1830, a 24-year-old farmer from upstate New York published a 600-page book he said was translated from golden plates delivered by an angel. Within 14 years, he had built a city, commanded a private army, declared himself a candidate for President of the United States, and was shot dead by a mob inside a county jail. His name was Joseph Smith, and the religion he founded now claims over 17 million members worldwide. But here is a question that has quietly followed the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for nearly 2 centuries. What if none of it was new? What if every doctrine, every revelation, every sacred ritual that Joseph Smith presented as divine communication from heaven already existed? In books sold in his local bookstores, in sermons preached within walking distance of his home, in secret ceremonies performed by fraternal organizations he personally joined. That is not a hypothetical accusation. That is a documented historical pattern. And over the next 20 minutes, we are going to walk through it, piece by piece. The Book of Mormon, the first vision, the priesthood, the translations, the health code, the temple ceremony. For each one, we will place Joseph Smith's revelation on one side and the cultural source material of his time on the other. And then you can decide for yourself what you are looking at. But before we begin with the Book of Mormon, keep one thing in the back of your mind. We are going to end this investigation inside a Masonic lodge in Nauvoo, Illinois, in March of 1842. A man who had been a Freemason for exactly 7 weeks introduced a sacred temple ceremony that borrowed the lodge's structure, symbols, clothing, gestures, and penalties, and called it a revelation from God. How he got there is the story we need to tell first. Part 1. The Book of Mormon and the Ideas. Already in the room. To understand the Book of Mormon, you first need to understand what Americans in the 1820s were already obsessed with. Across the northeastern United States, from Ohio to New York, thousands of ancient earthen mounds dotted the landscape. They were enormous. Some were geometric. Some contained human remains and artifacts of remarkable sophistication. And the burning question of the era was simple. Who built them? The prevailing theory, widely published and debated in newspapers, books, and public lectures, was that an advanced, light-skinned civilization had once inhabited the continent and had been destroyed by the ancestors of the Native Americans. This was not a fringe idea. It was mainstream intellectual discourse. Ethan Smith, a pastor in Poultney, Vermont, just miles from where Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Smith's future scribe, lived, published a book in 1823 called View of the Hebrews. Its thesis was striking. A civilized people of Israelite origin had migrated to ancient America, built a sophisticated society, and was eventually overwhelmed and annihilated by a savage faction. The Book of Mormon, published 7 years later, tells an almost structurally identical story. A righteous, light-skinned people called the Nephites, descended from Israelite migrants, builds a civilization in the Americas, and is ultimately destroyed by the darker-skinned Lamanites. The parallels were so extensive that B.H. Roberts, one of the most respected LDS historians and a member of the Church's own First Council of the 70, compiled a private study in the early 1920s comparing the two texts. His conclusion was devastating. He found 18 major points of similarity between View of the Hebrews and the Book of Mormon, and he could not explain them away. This was not an outside critic. This was one of the Church's own senior leaders, working privately, arriving at a conclusion he knew would be explosive. But the mound builder myth was only one ingredient. Joseph Smith grew up in the heart of the Second Great Awakening, one of the most explosive periods of religious fervor in American history. Traveling preachers held massive outdoor revivals across western New York, a region so frequently set ablaze by evangelical passion that historians call it the burned-over district. Camp meetings would draw thousands. Sermons lasted hours. Preachers competed for converts with theatrical emotion. Now consider the sermon of King Benjamin in the Book of Mosiah. It is one of the most celebrated passages in the Book of Mormon. A righteous king gathers his people around a tower and delivers a sweeping address about the natural man being an enemy to God, the necessity of spiritual rebirth, and the blood atonement of a coming Christ. Scholars have analyzed this sermon line by line and found that its themes, its rhetorical structure, and even its specific phrases closely mirror the Methodist camp meeting sermons of the 1820s. These were not ancient Israelite ideas. These were Protestant ideas, preached in the fields and barns within a day's ride of the Smith family farm. And then there are the anachronisms. The Book of Mormon contains long passages lifted almost word for word from the King James Bible, a translation completed in 1611. In several cases, the Book of Mormon reproduces translation errors specific to the King James Version that do not appear in older Hebrew or Greek manuscripts. Here is one concrete example. The Book of Mormon includes passages from Isaiah that scholars have identified as Deutero-Isaiah, chapters written during or after the Babylonian exile, around 550 BC. The Nephites supposedly left Jerusalem around 600 BC, before those chapters were composed. They could not have carried texts that did not yet exist. And yet the Book of Mormon quotes them, word for word, complete with King James phrasing from 1611, including translation choices that modern scholars have since corrected. The golden plates, if they existed, would have predated both the original Hebrew text and the English translation by centuries. Yet somehow they contain both. Every major narrative element of the Book of Mormon, the racial mythology, the sermon theology, the biblical text, had a documented source available to Joseph Smith before 1830. Not hidden, not obscure, sitting in plain sight. If you think these similarities in the Book of Mormon are coincidence, wait until you see what happened with the founding vision of the church itself. Part 2. The First Vision and the Visions everyone was having. The first vision is the founding event of Mormonism. According to the official account, in the spring of 1820, a 14-year-old Joseph Smith knelt in a grove of trees near his home in Palmyra, New York, and prayed to know which church was true. In response, God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to him in a pillar of light and told him that all existing churches were corrupt and that he would be the instrument of a restoration. It is a powerful story, but there is a problem with the historical record. Joseph Smith did not publicly share this account until 1838, 18 years after it allegedly occurred. The first written version, penned in 1832, describes only one divine being, not two. Earlier versions differ on Smith's age, on his motivation for praying, and on what exactly was said. The church's own historians acknowledge at least 4 distinct accounts of the first vision, each with significant discrepancies. But perhaps the most striking issue is not the internal contradictions. It is the external context. In the same years and the same region, other people were reporting almost identical experiences. In 1815, Norris Stearns published an account describing a vision in which he saw God and was told that existing churches had fallen from the truth. Asa Wilde in 1823 published a declaration in a Wayne County newspaper, Joseph Smith's own county, claiming that God had appeared to him and revealed that all Christian denominations were corrupt and that a great restoration was imminent. These accounts were not hidden manuscripts discovered by later researchers. They were published in local newspapers and pamphlets that circulated through the very communities where Joseph Smith lived. The language is remarkably similar. The structure is remarkably similar. The theological conclusion is remarkably similar. What historians recognize here is not a conspiracy, it is a cultural pattern. In the revivalist atmosphere of early 19th century America, claiming a personal vision of God was not extraordinary. It was almost expected. It was the spiritual currency of the era, the way people established religious authority in a marketplace of competing denominations. The question is not whether Joseph Smith sincerely believed he had a divine experience. The question is whether that experience was unique, or whether it was one of many nearly identical claims emerging from the same cultural soil at the same time. And if the vision itself followed a template, the doctrine that came next followed an even more traceable path, one that leads directly to a single man who walked through the door in late 1830. Part 3. The Priesthood that Arrived with Sidney Rigdon. Every organization needs 2 things to survive: a face and a framework. In the earliest days of Mormonism, Joseph Smith was the face. He was magnetic, physically imposing, and possessed a charisma that drew people in and held them. But he was not a trained theologian. He had no formal education in church history, biblical languages, or doctrinal systems. Sidney Rigdon was something entirely different. Rigdon was an experienced pastor, a gifted orator, and a serious student of theology. Before he ever met Joseph Smith, he had spent years as a preacher in the Campbellite movement, followers of Alexander Campbell, who were deeply invested in the idea of restoring the primitive Christian church as described in the New Testament. The Campbellites emphasized the authority of the ancient priesthood, the necessity of proper ordination, and the concept of apostolic succession. These were not vague spiritual ideas. They were specific doctrinal positions. and Rigdon had been teaching them for years. Rigdon converted to Mormonism in late 1830. And then something remarkable happened. Before Rigdon's arrival, the early Mormon church operated with a loose, informal structure. There was no elaborate priesthood hierarchy. There were no references to Melchizedek. The earliest documents of the church, including the Book of Commandments, the original publication of Joseph Smith's Revelations in 1833, make no mention of angelic priesthood restoration. After Rigdon's arrival, the theology rapidly incorporated precisely the concepts he had been preaching. Suddenly, there were two orders of priesthood. Suddenly, Peter, James, and John had appeared to confer authority. Suddenly, the entire structure that Rigdon had spent his career developing was embedded in the foundation of the church. The references to angelic visitation and specific priesthood orders appear only in later editions of these revelations, retroactively inserted into texts that originally contained no such language. The official timeline places the priesthood restoration before Rigdon's conversion, but the documentary record tells a different story. The theology only materialized in church documents after the man who had been teaching it for a decade walked through the door. Think of it this way. Joseph Smith provided the narrative power, the visions, the golden plates, the prophetic persona. Rigdon provided the theological architecture, the priesthood structure, the restorationist framework, the doctrinal scaffolding. Together, they built something neither could have built alone. But the blueprints Rigdon brought were not new. They were the same blueprints he had been drawing for the Campbellites for years. Part 4. The Translations and Their Earthly Sources. Joseph Smith positioned himself as a translator of ancient records, a prophet with unique access to lost knowledge. Two of his most significant translation projects were the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible and the texts related to the Book of Enoch. The JST is presented as a divinely inspired revision of the King James Bible. Smith claimed he was guided by the Holy Spirit to correct errors and restore lost passages, but recent scholarship has identified a remarkably specific source. Adam Clarke's Bible commentary was one of the most widely available reference works in early 19th century America. Published between 1810 and 1826, it could be found in bookstores, lending libraries, and private collections across the region where Smith lived. Researchers have documented over 200 instances where Joseph Smith's revisions correspond directly to suggestions, alternative readings, and interpretive notes found in Clarke's commentary. The parallels are too precise and too numerous to attribute to coincidence. In many cases, Smith's inspired corrections adopt Clarke's exact reasoning, his specific word choices, and his interpretive conclusions, presented not as scholarly commentary, but as divine revelation. Then there is the case of the Book of Enoch. In 1830, Joseph Smith produced a revelation that dramatically expanded the biblical figure of Enoch, describing his visions, his city called Zion, and his role in a cosmic plan of salvation. This was presented as lost scripture restored through prophetic power, knowledge that had been hidden from the world for millennia, now recovered through the gift of a seer. But Richard Laurence had published the first English translation of the ancient Book of Enoch in 1821, just 9 years earlier. Copies circulated in American academic and religious circles. The themes Joseph Smith revealed, Enoch's visions of heaven, his special city, his role as a seer, are present in Laurence's translation. The material was not lost, it was not inaccessible, it was in print, in English, and in circulation. Once again, the pattern holds. A text that was supposed to be inaccessible, lost to history, recoverable only through divine intervention, turns out to have been available at a local bookshop. Part 5. The Word of Wisdom and the Movement already in full swing. In February 1833, Joseph Smith received a revelation known as the Word of Wisdom. It counseled members against consuming alcohol, tobacco, and hot drinks, which the church later interpreted as coffee and tea. It also recommended eating grains and using meat sparingly. This is often presented to church members as evidence of prophetic foresight, health guidance decades ahead of modern medical science. But 1833 was not a vacuum. It was the peak of the American temperance movement. By the early 1830s, hundreds of temperance societies had formed across the United States. Newspapers published constant editorials about the dangers of alcohol. Anti-tobacco literature was widespread. Medical reformers like Sylvester Graham, whose name survives in the Graham Cracker, were lecturing extensively about the dangers of stimulants, including coffee and tea. Graham specifically advocated a grain-based diet and reduced meat consumption. His lectures drew enormous crowds. His dietary recommendations were published and debated in newspapers across the country. The Word of Wisdom does not contain a single health recommendation that was not already being publicly promoted by the temperance and health reform movements of the early 1830s. Every element, the warnings about alcohol, tobacco, and hot drinks, the emphasis on grains, was already in active public circulation. In fact, the revelation was given just weeks after a prominent temperance lecture series in the Kirtland, Ohio area, where Smith was living at the time. His wife, Emma Smith, had reportedly been complaining about the tobacco mess left by men chewing during church meetings. The timing and the context are difficult to ignore. What was presented as a message from heaven matched, almost word for word, what was being said on temperance lectern stages across the country. But even this parallel pales next to what we are about to see, because what happened inside a Masonic lodge in 1842 is where the pattern becomes impossible to look away from. The temple, the lodge, and 7 weeks. On March 15, 1842, Joseph Smith was initiated as an entered apprentice in the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge. The following day, just 1 day later, he was advanced to the degree of Fellow Craft and then raised to the degree of Master Mason. This was not just unusual, it was a violation of Masonic protocol. Standard Masonic practice required a waiting period of weeks or months between each of the 3 degrees, allowing the candidate to study and absorb the rituals before advancing. Smith completed all 3 in approximately 24 hours. The Grand Lodge of Illinois later cited the irregular speed of these advancements as one of its concerns with the Nauvoo Lodge. Whatever was happening, Joseph Smith was in a hurry. 7 weeks later, on May 4, 1842, Joseph Smith introduced the temple endowment ceremony to a small group of initiates on the upper floor of his red brick store in Nauvoo. What those initiates experienced that day bore an unmistakable resemblance to what happened inside a Masonic lodge. The endowment ceremony included ceremonial clothing with specific symbolic markings. Freemasonry used ceremonial aprons and regalia with specific symbolic markings. The endowment included a series of grips, ritualized handshakes, each associated with a specific name or phrase that served as a token of recognition. Masonic initiation included a series of grips, each associated with a specific word that served as a means of identification. The endowment included penalties, symbolic gestures representing the consequences of revealing sacred knowledge. Masonic degrees included penalties, symbolic gestures representing the consequences of revealing lodge secrets. The endowment involved a progression through stages of increasing knowledge, with new names and signs at each level. Masonic initiation involved a progression through degrees of increasing knowledge, with new passwords and signs at each level. The structural correspondence is not subtle. It is extensive, specific, and sequential. Joseph Smith explained the similarity by claiming that Freemasonry was a corrupted remnant of an ancient temple ceremony that he was now restoring to its original, pure form. But historians note that Freemasonry, in its modern ritualistic form, developed in 17th and 18th century Europe. There is no credible historical evidence linking Masonic ceremonies to Solomon's Temple or to any ancient priesthood practice. The simpler explanation is the one the timeline suggests. A man rushed through 3 Masonic degrees in a single day, absorbing an elaborate system of symbols, gestures, clothing, and ritual progression. 7 weeks later, he introduced a ceremony built on that same system and called it Revelation. Swedenborg and the 3 Heavens. There is one more parallel worth examining, and it connects to one of the most distinctive doctrines in Latter-day Saint theology. In February 1832, Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon reported a shared vision that became known as the Vision, now canonized as Doctrine and Covenants, section 76. It described 3 degrees of glory in the afterlife: the celestial, the terrestrial, and the telestial, corresponding to the glory of the sun, the moon, and the stars. This was a radical departure from traditional Christian theology. Instead of a simple heaven and hell binary, Smith presented a layered heaven, with different degrees of reward based on the quality of a person's faith and works. But Emanuel Swedenborg, the Swedish theologian and mystic, had published exactly this concept decades earlier. In his 1758 work, Heaven and Hell, Swedenborg described 3 heavens: a celestial heaven, a spiritual heaven, and a natural heaven, each corresponding to different degrees of light and glory. He used the imagery of the sun, the moon, and the stars to describe the diminishing radiance of each level. Swedenborg's writings had been translated into English and were circulating widely in America by the early 19th century. Swedenborgian societies existed in several American cities. His ideas were discussed in the same intellectual circles that debated theology, science, and the nature of the afterlife. The conceptual architecture is identical: three heavens, graduated glory, solar and stellar imagery. The only significant change is the vocabulary. Let us step back and look at what we have just covered. The Book of Mormon tells a story of ancient Israelites in America, a theory already published in view of the Hebrews and debated across New York before the book appeared. Its sermons mirror the Methodist revivals held in the fields around Joseph Smith's home. Its biblical text contains 17th-century English translation errors that could not exist on ancient plates. The first vision describes an experience that at least two other men in the same county published nearly identical accounts of during the same period. The priesthood restoration appears in no contemporary documents and enters the historical record only after a Campbellite preacher who had been teaching those exact concepts for years joined the movement. The Bible translation follows a commercially available commentary. The Enoch material mirrors a recently published English translation. The Word of Wisdom repeats the platform of the Temperance movement at its peak. The temple ceremony reproduces Masonic ritual 7 weeks after a rushed, protocol-violating initiation. The 3 degrees of glory replicate Swedenborg's 3 heavens, down to the celestial imagery. Each one of these, in isolation, could be explained as coincidence. 2 or 3 might be dismissed as superficial resemblance, but all of them together, following the same pattern, in the same direction, across every major doctrine? This does not tell you what to believe. History rarely does. But it does tell you what was in the room. It tells you what books were on the shelves, what sermons were in the air, what rituals were behind closed doors, and what ideas were circulating through the newspapers and lecture halls of early 19th century America. So here is the question this investigation leaves you with. When you place the revelations next to their sources and see the same ideas, the same structures, the same language, and the same timing, are you looking at a prophet who happened to receive revelations that matched his surroundings? Or are you looking at a remarkably gifted man who synthesized everything around him into something new and called it Scripture? The documents are there, the dates are there, the parallels are there. Were these divine confirmations of ancient truths, or were they reflections of a single time and place dressed in the language of eternity?